Alrighty, thank you everybody. Again, my name is Kurt Thomas. I'm a research scientist at Google. And today I want to present some joint research we did with the University College Berkeley on understanding what's the risk of stolen credentials in the wild. How are they being stolen? And then ultimately, how are accounts taken over? So the reason we're interested in this problem is because often these days, a single digital identity underpins all of the resources you connect to on the internet. So when you use a Google account, you'll upload all your files to the cloud, but you may use your Gmail address to associate with, say, signing up to a social network, or using it to interface with a financial institution. So this root of trust is jeopardized in the case of account takeover, and when that happens, all of these resources are at risk. And while there have been a lot of high-profile attacks that have made media headlines in the last year related to, say, journalists or politicians, it's really an endemic problem across the internet. There have been multiple studies now that have surveyed users and found that about 15% of users actually self-report having, say, an email account or a social network account compromised. The challenge, though, is that we don't really understand how this is happening. And there's a lot of ways that usually this can start with, which is like, were they phished? Did they have a piece of malware, like a keylogger, installed on their machine? Or were they a victim of a data breach at a third-party service? The other component to this question is that a lot of industry players have started to move beyond passwords as the sole form of authentication and move to risk-based systems. And so what this means is that when you sign in, even if you have the correct password, if you don't say come from a device we've seen you log in from before or location that you've logged in from before, we may either outright block that login attempt or ask for additional information that we hope a hijacker wouldn't have access to. So what our research, the primary goals that we had then was, first and foremost, how can we systematically measure the black market that's fueling this credential theft problem, and how many credentials are being stolen in the wild by these different vectors, be it phishing, malware, or third-party breaches. And then once an attacker has that password in their hands, how can we quantify what risk of account takeover there exists given this kind of risk-based analysis for sign-ins? And then ultimately, what lessons can we take away from this and all the research that we did, and how better to protect users moving forward? So one of the core cruxes of our research was basically building out an apparatus or a system to be able to monitor activity within the black market surrounding credential theft. And we were looking at three different segments. The first segment we cared a lot about was third-party data breaches. There's been a lot of headlines about this in the last year from various services across the internet, where you have millions or even billions of users who basically have their username and password exposed in various forms. Like it might be a salted hash, it could be just a normal hash, or maybe it's even decrypted. So the question we had is, how can we go about finding these database breaches in the wild, but with a caveat of saying we're never going to pay for stolen data. We want basically to acquire a free copy that somehow is surfaced to the public. So what we found is that there's actually a lot of forums and paste sites and even just random internet pages across, that you can find in Google search that specialize in basically sharing dumps. So these are just a couple of the examples that we found where you can say, find the MySpace breach, the Adobe breach, Badu.com, a couple of other companies that have been affected, and just go and freely download this on the internet. So I won't go into the full details of how the system works. Check out our paper if you want to. But what we did was we built out an apparatus to basically monitor 16 different private and public black market forums, 115 different paste sites like pastebin.com, and then actually scan all of the Google search index for candidate documents that we think contained basically stolen or exposed password data. And then we built a classifier to basically, first automatically parse things into columns and say, okay, and then from there, classify individual columns. So this looks like a username, this looks like a password, this looks like a user agent, and then verify actually the integrity of that data in that classification format. So what pops out of all of that process then is about 3.7 thousand database breaches that we were able to find just scanning the internet or interacting on forums, but again, never actually buying any data related to this. The other component here, though, is that a lot of these breaches, the passwords come in an MD5 or SHA-1 format, but are totally unsalted. So what we'll do is take a dictionary of about 3 to 4 billion passwords, the plain text versions that we know, pre-compute a hash of them, and basically invert the relationship there. And so at the end of all of this process, what pops out is about 1.9 billion credentials that we're able to collect across the internet, affecting a wide variety of services, not just Google, but like other identity providers and things like that. And the reason we care about this at Google is because there's frequent password reuse. So if we look at contemporaneous dumps, where we can actually associate the service that was affected with the dump we acquired, we find that about 17% of users, say, with a MySpace profile that also have a dating site profile, reuse the password there. And this is a little bit lower than other people have estimated in the past, but it's still a significant amount of users across the web that are reusing passwords. So setting that data set aside for a moment then, the second question we had is, okay, 1.9 billion credentials exposed through data breaches. What about phishing? How can we go and measure how many victims of phishing are out there right now? And we couldn't find any forums or websites that were dedicated to basically giving long lists of credentials that had been phished. What we were able to get our hands on was an initial seed set of about 10,000 phishing kits that were being deployed to compromise websites across the web. And what a phishing kit is basically an off-the-shelf piece of software that attackers will use to install on sites that includes, here's the landing page that a phisher is going to, or a victim is going to see, as well as the PHP backend, and then the mechanism for how those credentials are actually going to be reported to the attacker. And as part of this data set that kind of landed in our lap, we also were able to get a sample of 3.7 million victims of those specific phishing kits that happened over the course of about a year. So we didn't want to stop here. Like, this is a data set that we happened to acquire, but we wanted to say, how could we map this out and try to estimate even more broadly how many victims of phishing there are in the wild? And what we found is that looking through all the source code through all these phishing kits, almost all of them are configured to report all stolen credentials via email, and 72% of them happen to report to a Gmail address. So this is a phishing template that's shown here. What it's going to send to Gmail is a username, a password, the victim's phone number, and then an IP address that it harvests from them. And then it's going to send it to a Gmail account that's under the attacker's control. So the idea we had then was we can actually estimate how often this is happening in the wild by taking those sample of phishing kits, doing some automated static analysis to basically, let's look at this source code again. You identify the mail code at the very bottom. You can identify then what the subject is going to be and what the strings are going to be in the message body, and actually build a rule to identify that specific phishing kit. And so what we were able to do is build about 7.3 thousand different templates. So these are basically saying 7.3 thousand different phishing kit variants that we know of. And for every inbound message that was going to Gmail, see whether or not any of these matched. And this isn't a fully novel technique. There have been people in the past that have done it, but we kind of did this at scale, and we were able to identify about 12 million victims in the last year of phishing. And the other thing we can start to look at is who are the operators of those accounts? So we know that somebody's going to be accessing that Gmail account to pull down all that stolen data. So what we did is looked at it, and we found about 19,000 accounts in total, which is actually fairly small for the amount of damage those small number of people are causing. And then we find that 41% of them are logging in from an IP address from Nigeria, which is a highly concentrated group of bad actors basically perpetrating all this harm, or at least maybe a proxy that they're using. And what this small number of actors are doing, that 19,000 people, is phishing 200, 300,000 people every single week. The only noticeable dip we saw in this trend was around the holiday season of last year, when either users aren't online or maybe phishers are taking a break for the holiday as well. And from that initial set of 3.7 million accounts, we looked at what fraction were Google, and if they were Google accounts, where did the victims actually come from? And predominantly, a lot of victims are from the United States, but also South Africa, Canada, India, and the United Kingdom, all places where English is a spoken language, which gives you some sense of where phishers are targeting with this mode of operation. So the last data set we wanted to look at was, well, let's look at some forms of malware that are deployed in the wild, and we focused specifically on keyloggers. And again, there weren't any forums or anything dedicated to finding large sets of victims that have been with keyloggers. But what we could get our hands on is basically a sample of about 15,000 different keylogger binaries. Popular variants are like Hawkeye and Predator Pane. Basically, keyloggers have somewhat evolved over time, and now it's not just what are your keystrokes, but they'll go and read your password stores, they'll go and read lots of other files that are located on your machine. And along with that sample of 15,000 binaries, we were able to get a sample of about 3,000 known victims who had those keyloggers installed on their devices. It turns out, though, just like phishing kits, a lot of these keyloggers are configured to do all of their reporting via SMTP. So 39% of that 15,000 binaries we got our hands on all reported to Gmail The next most popular mail provider was like Mail.ru, and there were a couple others after that. And what that report looks like is something like shown here. Basically it says, here's the operating system I just installed on, here's the victim's IP address, and here's all the passwords that I was able to harvest from the local password stores on the device. So similar to what we did with the phishing kit pipeline, we took all of these binaries, we ran them in a sandbox execution environment, and that execution environment had credentials stored on there. One for Google, one for Facebook, and a couple other different services. And then what we were able to do is basically have those keyloggers trigger and send their email report. And then we looked for text invariants inside those emails that we could basically differentiate to say, this is always going to be what a malware report looks like from these different keyloggers. And we were able to identify about 315 different styles of reports. So these are basically the families of those 15,000 binaries. And then again, deploy this, check all inbound messages to see how many keyloggers are reporting to Google. And over the course of about a year, there were 788,000 victims that we estimate had keyloggers installed on their devices. So these three data sets, last thing with that is that, examining, again, the email addresses that are receiving all of these keylogger reports, we see that about 26% of them are located in Nigeria, as well as Brazil and Senegal. So concentration, again, in a small number of countries, but way less reporters. Only about 1,000 email accounts where basically all these keylogger reports are going to, compared to, say, 19,000 for phishing. And we see basically a steady decline in the volume of these different variants. And it may be because new keyloggers are coming out, or basically favor in these is falling over time. But it's usually on the order of 10 to 20,000 victims a week, which is an order of magnitude less than we see of phishing. And in terms of where the victims are located, it's vastly different from phishing. It's Brazil, it's India, the United States, Turkey, and the Philippines. We notice that there's a tight coupling between where the victim is and where the attacker is. So if you're targeting Brazilian users, the attacker happens to usually be in Brazil as well. In comparison to phishing, where you're targeting largely English-speaking countries, and then the phisher happens to be located somewhere across the globe. So we have these three large data sets, and we can say, there's billions of credentials out there for data breaches, and tens of millions for phishing, and even less for keyloggers. But what's the actual risk to users when their credentials are stolen by one of these three different vectors? And it's not the same. So to measure this, we took those initial samples that we had, the millions of phishing victims, the thousands of keylogging victims, and the billions of credential victims we were able to identify with our data sets. And the first thing we looked at is, what's the prevalence of Google accounts amongst each of those data sets? We're a little bit biased as to what problem we cared about, so we looked at this in particular. And we found that, for phishing and keylogging, about 30% of all the victims that were being targeted were related to Google. Whereas with data breaches, it was only 12%. Yahoo and Hotmail were the other major identity providers that were being affected by data breaches at third parties. The second question we asked, though, okay, let's focus just on those Google accounts. What's the likelihood that your current Google password is exposed via one of these mechanisms? And we found that for phishing, it was about 25%, whereas for data breaches, it was only about 7%. And that low amount for data breaches makes sense. Like, a lot of these dumps date back to 2012 or 2014. There's a long time in which users can actually go and reset their passwords so that it no longer matches their current Google password. Whereas for phishing, the only reason it's not 100% is that you may use your Gmail account as an identifier for, say, your Facebook login or any other service, but you may not reuse your password between those two sites. So the first is measuring both password reuse, whereas the third-party data breaches is measuring password reuse as well as staleness over time that's happening. And the last criteria we looked at then was, okay, if your password was valid and exposed via one of these mechanisms, what's the likelihood in the last year that we detected you as being hijacked? Now, the problem is we don't know every account that's been hijacked, so I'm showing relative numbers here rather than percentages. And so the denominator here is compared to, say, just a random user. Because if there's no signal in, say, being part of a third-party data breach, we'd say it should just be parity. You should be equally likely to be compromised in a third-party breach versus now, given these risk-based systems that we have. But we see something different. For phishing, we see that users are 400 times more likely than a random user to be hijacked, which means that there is strong signal of what hijackers are doing once they get your phish credential, and that they are succeeding despite some of the risk-based systems we have in place. Where in comparison, third-party data breaches are much less effective at basically bypassing our defenses. And we can actually find some evidence of this into how those systems are actually working in practice. So if we look at the source code for all of the phishing kits and all of the keyloggers, and we look at the data that we're able to identify in different data breaches, everybody's collecting usernames and passwords. The only reasons it's not 100% in the top two is because a lot of the phishing kits we also see are banking related, in which case they're not necessarily looking for your password, they're looking for your credit card. But if we look at the other types of information that are being stolen, we see geolocation, user agent, phone number, and secret questions. And almost all of that is only being stolen by phishing kits. And we use those types of information, one, to assess the integrity of the device at sign-in for these risk-based profiles, but also for when we think it's a risky sign-in, we'll challenge you and say, hey, tell us what your phone number is, or tell us what your secondary email address is. And if attackers are basically adapting and collecting that information, it means they can bypass some of these weaker challenges. So the last thing we wanted to examine then is like, how can we digest this research and understand how better to protect users moving forward? And I think the most important takeaway you can come away with this talk is that the paradigm of passwords as a sole authentication factor is very outdated. And what you need to do instead is practice this notion of defense in depth. So at Google, we do a lot of different things. With safe browsing, whenever you go to a phishing site or a site suspected of delivering malware, we'll show a warning in the hopes that a user never actually has their credential exposed to an attacker. If by chance a victim happens to not see a warning or they happen to click through that warning, the second thing we do is basically risk-based analysis at the time of sign-in. And the best challenges we can show you are if you have a phone number associated with your account, we can say, hey, verify this SMS challenge, or say yes or no on your phone, whether this is you trying to log in at the time. So it's effectively the same thing as two-step verification, but in this case, it's dynamic. It mitigates some of the risk of account lockout because it's not done at every sign-in. It's only done at a sign-in when we don't recognize the device or we don't recognize, say, the location. So you can always move back to one of those two things to get around the fact that maybe you lost your two-factor auth dongle or something like that. The third thing we do is that when we see suspicious activity, either at the sign-in time or in session, so even after you log in, we'll periodically scan what's going on, and we'll alert the individual user that, hey, we blocked the sign-in attempt. It looks suspicious. Can you do something to, was this you? Or maybe you want to update your password. Or maybe you want to confirm, add a phone number to your account so we can better protect you moving forward. And so we try to engage with users to make them take a stance in also protecting their privacy and security. So the other thing you can do that we found is really effective is actually proactively reset user passwords. So as a consequence of this research, we found lots of billions of users affected by breaches, and only 7% of them actually had their Google password matching. But for those 7%, as well as for the victims of phishing and keylogging, what we do is proactively reset their password and say, we know this is exposed to an attacker in the wild. We want you to take some action to resecure your account. And from that, we were able to resecure 67 million different users. So wrapping up then, the key takeaways I think for this talk are first and foremost, there are billions of passwords that are available to hijackers right now. But there's a small silver lining to this, which is that we can actually use this type of data to assess both the quality of our defenses as well as to map out what the ecosystem looks like right now in the black market for how passwords are being stolen. And the second thing is that if you're an identity provider or working in this space, you need to start thinking about passwords as being outdated and instead move to this defense in depth approach, as well as proactively resetting passwords. And so with that, thank you for your time.
Step up to the mic for questions. Okay. I'll throw one out to get things going. Well, maybe two. So the first one is, why do you think that that all these attackers rely so much on Google infrastructure to receive their credentials? Like, it seems counterintuitive to me. Let's send the credentials to Gmail instead of my own domain, right? And the second question is, to the extent that you can share, what sort of tricks are the phishers or scammers in general using to bypass your risk management or your risk identification sort of mechanisms?
Yeah, so to the first question about why Gmail, if we look at historical botnets, when you have a lot of infrastructure, you'll use things like DGAs or some sort of C2 infrastructure that you control. The problem is that a lot of these compromised websites are basically only up for, say, a day or a week. And so you need something to be able to deploy to basically get the phishing page online, but need a reliable way of reporting all of that data. And owning your own database and other things happens to be very vulnerable to takedown. And it just seems to be that people have kind of relied on email. And this isn't like a new phenomenon. Like phishing kits dating back to like 2010 continue to use SMTP. So it's kind of a lack of pressure from the security community so far to make them change that. To the second question, like how are hijackers bypassing risk analysis? It turns out for most cases, we do identify that this is a risky sign-in, but that the verification step that we do following, a lot of users don't have a phone number associated with their account that we can send a much more secure challenge. So if we can do an SMS prompt, we can basically block almost all hijackers from accessing your account. But in the event you don't have a phone that's active and associated, we can only fall back to knowledge-based challenges. And things like asking you, what is your phone number, or what is your secondary email, or where did you last log in from, are all both phishable, as well as sometimes available in other database breaches that have happened.
Okay.
So yeah.
Ada Lerner, Wellesley College. Nice talk, thank you. The data is really, really interesting, and I felt like the defenses were a little more, I didn't see the connection between the defenses and the data here, so I'm curious if you could say a little bit more about sort of how can you use this type of data to effectively prioritize what defenses you're deploying, or how is Google thinking about using it?
Yeah, so fair question. First and foremost, I'd say the best way to get the answer to that is we have an Enigma talk this year that's going to talk all about how our risk analysis works. So you'll find out more details then, but I can tease some of how we're using this data right now, which is, let's say we just talked about which challenges are weak versus not. We can actually take these accounts that we think are at high risk because they've been in one of these feeds, and then go look for what was the weakest challenge that was solved to access this account recently. And then if we see particular challenges that are like not performing well, very much like warnings that don't work very well, we can deprecate those in favor of other stronger challenges. So that's one of the core ways. The other is to basically use this as a tap to proactively resecure users, and that's where that 67 million number came from. So those are the two primary mechanisms we're using it right now.
Awesome, thank you.
Hello, Emily Stark, Google. Do you have any theories as to why keyloggers tend to be geographically correlated with their victims?
This is a good question. So we have two hypotheses. One is we were talking to some people on the security team, and they basically said USB sticks are a common way in which this type of malware is distributed, and therefore you need geographic proximity to where the victims are going to be. The other is we saw a lot of this activity was in like Iran and a couple other countries in the Middle East and others. And so we couldn't say definitively, but we didn't know whether it was a relation to basically law enforcement or other people who are kind of using some of these mechanisms. And I shouldn't necessarily say law enforcement, it could be worse than that, that are basically targeting individuals in those respective states. So those are the two hypotheses we have as why it's geolocated right now.
So Brian Parno from Carnegie Mellon. So Cormac Hurley and some of his co-authors have sort of long argued that having complex passwords doesn't necessarily make sense for users if their data is already being lost through keyloggers or phishing. Mm-hmm. Would you say that this supports that data, or do you think there's enough breaches happening that they should still be using more complex passwords?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of pure volume, we see that data breaches are 2 orders of magnitude larger than keyloggers and an order of magnitude larger than phishing, or more than that actually. So in that respect, there is a strong motivation, and we see password reuse both now as well as historically ranges above 7%. So there's a strong reason for password managers or really strong passwords in that case to also both tamp down on reuse as well as to make them less guessable. Because one of the components we didn't study with this research is, even if your password is exposed in one of these historical breaches, I think there was a talk yesterday about this, lots of users just append, a digit or something else to it. So there, again, strong passwords, not just tweaking it afterwards when a lot of the material is known, but fundamentally changing it is really important still.
Cool, thanks.
All right, let's thank the speaker.
Thank you.